if you start over-specifying the question, you start teaching them how to answer your question. So you don't get the depth, you don't get this sort of authentic response, you get the confirmation of your current mental model or framing. The irony is that's not what you're trying to do when you do that. You're trying to be helpful, but I think it has the opposite effect. And so this to me is like the number one thing to stop doing.
There's an art to interviewing customers. It's so much harder than just asking a few people some questions. If we're not careful, bias can throw off our findings, and sometimes the most salient information that may inform the next generation of your products can slip by even the most seasoned researchers. Few people have mastered interviewing users as well as our guest today, author and independent research practitioner, Mr. Steve Portigal.
Steve's just released a second edition to his popular book, Interviewing Users, that expands upon the principles and techniques introduced in the first edition and provides guidance for conducting user research remotely. It's essential stuff for anyone in UX. This is Design Better, where we explore creativity at the intersection of design and technology. I'm Eli Woolard.
And I'm Aaron Walter. You can get ad-free episodes, bonus content, discounted workshops, and access to our monthly AMAs with big names in design and tech by becoming a Design Better premium subscriber. It's also the best way to support the show. Visit designbetterpodcast.com/subscribe to learn more and go deeper into design. We'll return to the conversation after this quick break. Few things frustrate designers quite as much as seeing the UI that they've been meticulously designing botched when it's built out. But Zeppelin can help you make every design to dev handoff efficient and accurate so you can nail every release on time and on budget. Zeppelin documents your design system, user journeys, design specs, and code snippets so your developers know exactly what to build and everyone has a shared understanding of your product. And Zeppelin integrates with your entire tool stack, including Figma, Sketch, Adobe XD, Jira, and Storybook. Plus, Zeppelin has a new plan where you can get unlimited seats for one flat rate for just $15 a month. Other tools are charging $15 or more per developer seat. With Zeppelin, you get unlimited seats for just $15. That means you can invite your entire team or freelance clients without worrying about being hit with a big unexpected bill. Design Better listeners can get their first month of the basic plan for free with code DESIGNBETTER. All caps, just one word. Design Better. Just go to zeppelin.io and use code DESIGNBETTER to get your first month of the basic plan for free. That's zeppelin.io, zeppelin.io, and use the code DESIGNBETTER. Build better workflows and collaborative relationships between design and development with Zeppelin. And now, back to the show. Steve Portigal, welcome to Design Better.
So nice to get to speak with you both.
Steve, I've known you for a while. I don't know when we met per se, but maybe just before we dive into your new book, second edition of your book about interviewing users, customers, which is a fantastic reference. I very much enjoyed it. Maybe we could just talk a little bit about your background and what you do on a day-to-day basis as a researcher.
Yeah, I have my own consulting practice that I've had since, I guess, 2001 as a user researcher, as a consultant. Day to day, this has always been true about research. I remember even in the 90s working at an agency and people would come in and interview and they thought that the researchers were just doing research, like the actual act of interviewing people, like, 37 hours a week. And of course, it's not the case. You're doing all the activities to support that before, during, and after. And I think that's the same as true for me. Actually interviewing, I don't do as much of that as I would like to, but I have other activities that I'm involved in, like trying to support a business, writing. I do a lot of teaching and workshops for clients, which is not conducting research, but it's sort of tied to those skills. Teaching people to do something is a great way to get better at it yourself, and practicing it yourself is a great way to get better at teaching. So all these things kind of fit together. But boy, there's no 2 days that are alike. And of course, our work, anyone that sort of works in Western corporations is in meetings. You're in meetings talking about the message that you're going to send out, coordinating communications or reports, or, helping things work their way through the system, making sure that we have the thing right that's going to go to this leader so they know the other thing. The work that kind of goes around the work. So yeah, I guess I don't get bored because I get to do, even from a task basis, what am I working on? It's just in so many different kinds of directions.
Steve, you've also been independent for a long time, over 20 years, looks like, at least from the LinkedIn sleuthing we were doing. I've personally bounced back and forth between working for a company and being on my own, and Aaron and I have kind of embarked on this entrepreneurial journey together of taking the show independent this year. What's if there's a kind of a high level overview of just that length of independence and the pros and cons around that, maybe you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I remember going to have lunch with somebody working at Frog Design at the time. We were just talking about career paths and different kinds of places that people were working. And I don't know, I expressed some insecurity about something. And he just looks at me and says, Steve, you're probably never going to interview for a job again. And, so much of my upbringing, high school, you learn how to have a resume, and maybe it's different in the current times, but, I was brought up to have the skills to get a job, maybe not keep a job or whatever, but that was an orientation. And so when this guy made that comment, it was it's not that the heavens parted, it was somewhere between the heavens parted and someone threw a big bucket of water on me. I was on a path that, I guess diverged from what a lot of middle class North American society kind of participates in. And certainly, in the design world, you can't go anywhere without people talking about portfolios and interviews. And if you spend time on LinkedIn right now, people are either hiring or grieving. So that part of it is it's a big part of the discourse. And I feel a little bit on the outside looking in, I don't even know what that's like. I think after 20 plus years of working on my own, and this is just an insecurity, I don't know if I could get a job. I don't know if I'm employable. When people tell me they get constantly harangued by recruiters during certain times, obviously we're not in one of those as of today, but in certain times, I think, wow, that never happens to me. So what about my sort of story is less searchable or keywordy? I've been doing user research for 30 years across all kinds of industries and written books and spoken at conferences. I'm qualified, but am I qualified to work in corporate America or to get hired or to do all that stuff? And every once in a while, I do kind of a thought exercise, how would I learn how to apply for a job and, try to land a job? And how would I learn how to perform some of the parts of the job that are different than what I do in running my own consultancy? Being independent is always ups and downs. And there are certainly points where you feel oh, this isn't working. I better give it up and start thinking more seriously about what would it look like to kind of go in another direction, try to get an actual job with an employer and a paycheck and so on. But I haven't done it. And I guess I'm on a path, and something's going to have to really change to take me off that path. And I think there's a certain amount of default. I didn't set out to not get a job. The first job I got was at an agency. That's where the jobs were in the mid 90s. And that's where I learned the first part of my craft. That company disappeared during the economic crash of 2001. I did some interviews. I did an interview at an online search portal that we don't think about as much anymore. The recruiter got laid off between the interview and the time they were going to follow up with me. Things were kind of dissipating. And so I just ended up building a practice very, very slowly, trying to figure out what to do. And I was encouraged by people that said, yeah, I don't see you. I had one mentor that said, I don't see you working for somebody else. I don't know. It's a little bit of default and a little bit of well, this is working. But I never had the dream to run my own business. There's a lot of things that I don't know what I'm doing, even though I've been doing it for a long time. And I guess any skill, right? The further you go, the more you realize how little you know about things.
Yeah, I think that's true for most of us. I totally identify with
you get in deep and you don't know what you're doing, but you just keep plodding forward. I think that's what being a grown-up is just plodding forward, even when you don't know if it's the right way. But I'm curious, there's probably more than just it's the default for you, but there's got to be something that you really like about being independent versus if you were getting that steady paycheck, it ain't free, it comes with strings. What do you like about being independent?
Yeah, I mean, I do like independence. I mean, it's a lifestyle, right? I'm spending time today talking with you. That's entirely my choice. It's like a really positive thing for me to focus on this. This is good for me creatively, intellectually. I think this is good for me professionally. My business needs me to talk about myself or get my name and my work out there. I like doing that. Like, I like speaking at conferences and getting to go places and meet people. And, you go to a conference and you're a speaker, people come up to you and ask you questions. So if you're introverted the way I am, I don't have to like walk up and introduce myself to people. People seek me out. I've chosen to work for myself in a way where I have a public profile. I don't have a sales staff or, business development people or all that aspect of it. And my work has often been driven by creating content, being part of discussions, writing books, doing things that help people in the field learn, reflect, start discussions. I think we use the word thought leader, and then sometimes we make fun of the word thought leader because it's a little bit of a pretentious term or an arrogant term. There is a default aspect to that. I sort of don't know any other way but that, but I like doing that. It feeds me, despite being introverted, it feeds me socially, it feeds me creatively. It gives me access to a network of people. I know people from all over the place, and doing thought leadership as a way of building my brand or building my business as this feels more comfortable over time. So that aspect I think has been really good. And it's great to go into a meeting with a prospective client and have them either know me or know of me, or having, engage with something that I've done and tell me that they saw a talk that I did or that they've read something. And that really makes those initial conversations less about, me trying to prove myself and more about let's figure out what the opportunity is here to do something. And so, yeah, by sort of choosing a public path, I get a lot of support and encouragement and affirmation. That's not just being independent. That's sort of the nature of the face I've kind of put on that. I get to work on different things across industries and learn just enough to kind of try to make sense of a different organization or a different problem or product. That's exciting. And you start to eventually see connections across things. Oh, this is like this completely unrelated thing in this other industry. I think that makes me a better consultant. I've just experienced different kinds of organizations. For sure, it makes me a better researcher. I don't know, pros and cons is interesting. Like when I meet people who work in a domain and they are talking to, say, school teachers and school administrators and parents of school children for years, there's got to be something really cool about that depth of knowledge, like sort of process knowledge. Not that a researcher knows what a teacher is going to say, but they know the environment they're going into. They know some of the logistics. They know maybe the emotional tone that's going to be most effective for building those relationships. I don't have that depth. I've interviewed people in all kinds of contexts, but I don't know this particular one. So grass is greener, I guess, in other places. But the variety suits me. I like long-term relationships, but I also like that we're on opposite sides of like a permeable membrane, right? I don't work for their company. They haven't hired me to be an employee. We can part ways and get back together. I can be sort of minimally engaged or more fully engaged over time. So I like that. It just sort of suits my temperament, I think.
Maybe just one more question on the topic of being independent for folks, right now who maybe just decided to take this route either because they left their job willfully or were laid off. Do you have any like quick kind of pro tips for folks that are just new to being a consultant or freelancer or contractor?
The key is in the way that you said that, right? Consultant, contractor, freelancer. I just went in depth about like my model and why it suits me, but there are so many models out there. I wouldn't expect someone that's a freelancer to have a website describing their services or to be doing thought leadership work as part of building their brand. I met someone in the Bay Area. They're like a serial contractor. They take like maternity leave covers or short-term contracts, but they'll go work at like a big Silicon Valley company for 8 months. And so they exist as an employee without, of course, access to the transit, access to the bus. They can't do all that stuff. They don't get all the benefits, but they work on a team as an independent contributor for 8 months. And then the next gig comes along. And they loved that model. And that just terrified me for all sorts of reasons. It sounded just unpleasant for a lot of reasons. So in terms of advice, there are a lot of models. And I think, if I was just like peering through that porthole for the first day, I would let me talk to a few different people and just see how do they think about their work, who their clients are, what they want to get out of it. The questions that you kind of asked me up front, and see what one resonates with them. And of course, it's not a tattoo, right? You can change it. So I would, encourage them to explore and try a couple of things and sort of, have some role models is too aspirational a term, but have some things to emulate and kind of try to see what you like. Because there is just a lot of different ways to kind of construct the independent working life as opposed to the employed working life.
Steve, let's talk about your book, second edition of Interviewing Users. I'm kind of surprised that there aren't more books on this topic because it's such an important topic. It's really an art and a science squished into one. Why a second edition? Why now?
The now kind of drives it a little bit. It's the 10th anniversary this year of the book coming out. The folks at Rosenfeld Media approached me, I don't know, let's just say 18 months, 2 years ago. Steve, would you want to do a second edition? Back to what we're talking about, sort of thought leadership stuff. I've written 2 books. I sort of saw what impact that had on me as the story about me, how that kind of evolved. And I remember saying well, I'd never write another book because what would it do for me? It's a big effort. So I was sort of dismissive of it a while ago. So they asked me, would I consider doing a second edition? And I just thought, why? Right? I just was really kind of dismissive of it. And then shortly after that, started thinking about, it's been 10 years. And that just from a selfish point of view, that's sort of an anniversary that I wanted to acknowledge. I started thinking about, what should I do for 10 years? And I pitched that to somebody, what do you think? And they said to me, have you ever thought of doing a second edition? And then started talking about their own experiences doing that. And suddenly something that I had just flat out rejected, knee jerk, no, it made a lot of sense. And I started asking myself, what has changed and what else do I have to say? Because I think I had thought that the book was evergreen. The first edition was evergreen, that there were some things that had changed, but the fundamentals of talking to people, listening, asking questions, squishing together that art and science, I stand behind that. So why would I kind of do something different? But then, just asking myself, what would that be? And, beyond sort of celebrating 10 years, what would that be? And turns out I quickly had a lot of things that kind of got me going that I would want to talk about. And so that made the project seem almost urgent, a vital opportunity here to talk about things in a 2023 context and not a 2013 context.
It sounds like some of the new things that you covered, and maybe we'll just hone in on a few and can talk about them, but things like remote interviewing, which I'm guessing post-pandemic have become a lot more common. Maybe talk a little bit about some of the perhaps more tactical things that you included here that just weren't as maybe omnipresent in the first edition of the book.
Right. Remote research gets mentioned in the first book. I talked about using Skype. I talked about phone interviews, but they were kind of positioned, in a little more of a secondary fashion to other kinds of research. And yes, you're right. I think pandemic brought remote research to be the thing. It was the only way for most people in most contexts for quite a long time. And I think we got pretty smart about it. There's maybe more than one, but Nate Bolt's book about remote research was actually published before the first edition of Interviewing Users. It was published in 2010. I'm sure Nate could write 22 more books, about all that he's done since then, if that were his interest. But, we've gotten a lot smarter. And I think one of the things you saw in the pandemic was a lot of advice and support about how are we going to work in this environment? How are we going to run workshops? How are we going to do teaching? How are we going to do research? Everything kind of came up. as well as, discussions of things like Zoom fatigue, because it wasn't just the research, it was the way that sort of knowledge work was happening. And so I think there was a lot more to say about that. Kind of our overall discourse is much more informed. I asked someone who's a great researcher I know to take a couple pictures of their setup and, to give a little more concrete advice. If you're going to interview somebody, where's your guide? Remote research now, we have probably people on Slack, or depending on what your setup is, you can have sort of a secret back room. Like I think early days we were figuring out we've got a bunch of people joining a Zoom call and it's quite chaotic. And then people started to figure out ways, our very smart operations people figured out how to pipe the call into another call that was a view only area. So a lot of sort of technical things, but that made the work succeed versus fail. And so trying to bring in what does that look like now? The tools have changed. The context that we're kind of bringing people in to participate, our participants and our stakeholders, the idea of putting a researcher in that back room to kind of do color commentary and to facilitate the communication between the sort of observers and the researchers, so that you don't have a poor researcher trying to manage a conversation in a Zoom call and keep an eye on a window. And I know some people can do this. I can't, and I don't think it's great for people to do it. The context has changed and the tactics have changed and the tools have changed. Yeah, so I wanted to try to, not maybe the definitive guide to remote research, I don't think that was my goal here, but to really talk about what some of these best practices are and why, without sort of being, here's how you make Google Meets work with this and this. Not really like a technical manual, but it's all about stringing people together in an interactive way that suits them, that takes care of them, and you have all these different participants. So yeah, that's something that seemed like we needed to talk about in a richer and more specific way now than we would even ever imagine 10 years ago.
Steve, could you walk us through just a few of the best practices for interviewing users the right way? There's a number of things that we could do where we might introduce biases or just inefficiencies. What are some of the best practices that you advocate for?
I think one thing that people do, this is a thing that people do with the best of intentions, but coming from a place of less experience, which is to talk about themselves as a way to establish rapport. And this idea of establishing rapport is very, very important, right? You want to have a connection with somebody. We talk about comfort. I mean, rapport is this kind of energy which makes the interview kind of go without it feeling like work for either party. There's a well-intentioned and very understandable approach for someone that's new. I mean, the thing with research and interviewing is that it looks like normal things that we do: conversation, talking, listening, questions. And yet the best practices don't look like that. So you see people making mistakes that seem like an obvious thing to try. So talking about yourself. So you're interviewing somebody and maybe doing a little warm-up conversation, and they say, oh yeah, I was really interested in, some of these TV shows that Disney Plus was putting on from the Marvel Cinematic Universe, but then it got too complicated and I couldn't keep track of it. And so I didn't go see this new movie for that reason. And you, the interviewer, thinking OMG, I know what that's like. I saw this, you start thinking about all your experiences and you get kind of excited and a little jumpy and a little shaky. And because you're trying so hard to connect with this person, you want to tell them that you're just like them, right? I also had that. I know, right? This one was terrible. And I think that is a thing maybe you do in a social setting, but it's not something to do in a research interview, because what you have the power and the opportunity to do is make everything about them, because the interview is about them. And so it's just as effective to ask that person, well, what was it about that you didn't like? And it is to keep asking them more questions and set up that dynamic where you are really interested in them. Because that's the rapport builder. The rapport builder is not, hey, I also am a person that watches, Disney Plus. So the rapport builder is, I'm interested in what you're saying. It's super interesting and I want to know more about it. So making all those choices to kind of do that. The Jedi level, just to pull in Disney Plus references here, the Jedi level is making very limited, selective, strategic choices about when you do talk about yourself. This is often when somebody is sort of hesitant. They sense that maybe they're at the risk of being judged. I had this happen to me where someone was talking about their profession, and they're a certain kind of like caseworker for young people. And it sounded similar to the work that my partner does. Like that flag goes off. I'm like, OMG in my head. That's what, my partner does, and da, 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 da. And I didn't say anything. And it was probably 45 minutes later in this interview that this person we were talking to catches herself. She's talking about a coping strategy for like some pretty intense work. And her coping strategy with her coworkers is Black humor. They would make jokes about things. This person could not have been more on her face, like completely compassionate and just driven to make change and help people. And then she's admitting to me, it feels like an admission the way that she's saying, she's admitting to me that she makes jokes. And you could see her kind of start and then stop, and like her face just kind of fell. And I responded about myself truthfully. I said that my partner does similar work, and I know that her and her colleagues, do this as well as a coping mechanism. So that was true. And I didn't say anything about it at the beginning because it wasn't about her. And I said it at that time because she needed some help. She needed some permission, some normalization to continue. So I gave her that at the time. That's what the interview needed. That's what this person needed. That may not happen in any interview. That's a rare occurrence. But having had that thought at the beginning and then just put it back on the shelf, I was kind of primed to respond to something that I didn't know was ever going to come up in that interview. So the basic advice is like just 99% about them. And the advanced advice is like, if you can help them, you can definitely share something. But, you want to choose those moments kind of judiciously.
We'll return to the conversation after this quick break. I'm a big believer that travel is an essential part of living a creative life. It gets me out of my comfort zone, it connects me to new people, and it broadens my perspective on the world. Just in the past 6 months, I've been to Paris, Japan twice, and soon I'm heading to South Africa and Zimbabwe. To get the most out of my adventures, I do my best to pick up some of the local language before I go, and Babbel has become my go-to tool to learn languages quickly. Babbel's quick 10-minute lessons are created by over 200 language experts to help you start speaking a new language in as little as 3 weeks. It's conversational, practical, and it's reinforced as you progress, so what you learn, it actually sticks with you. You can learn Spanish, French, German, Italian, Portuguese, Swedish, Russian, Turkish, Dutch, Polish, Norwegian, Indonesian, or Danish. It's fun, and man, it's so rewarding. And here's a special limited time deal for our Design Better listeners. Right now, you can get up to 60% off your Babbel subscription at babbel.com/designbetter. Get up to 60% off at babbel.com/designbetter, and that's spelled BABBEL.com/designbetter. Rules and restrictions may apply. This message is sponsored by Greenlight. In the Walter household, we're big fans of Greenlight, and I'd like to introduce you to my son, Bellamy, who's 10, to tell you just how amazing Greenlight is. Hey, Bellamy, you made a big purchase recently. What did you buy?
An electric scooter.
Are you pretty excited about it?
Yeah.
How did you manage to pay for something so pricey?
Well, I've been saving up a lot, and I invest in a lot of companies.
And you did that with a special account that I was able to set up that gave us an opportunity to learn together about investing, right?
Yeah.
So I set up a custodial account, and what kind of companies did we invest in?
I invest in Minecraft, Roblox, and Tesla.
And how'd you learn about all that stuff? You seem pretty smart about how to manage your money.
Greenlight.
Really?
Mm-hmm.
Tell me more about it.
Yeah, it's a debit card for kids. And kids can use it to pay for like stuff that they really like or want, like a toy or a bike or something.
So probably tomorrow you should be getting your new scooter. Do you have any big plans?
I'm gonna ride around with my brother.
Bellamy has learned so much from using Greenlight, and I know that your kids will too. Sign up for Greenlight today and get your first month free when you go to greenlight.com/designbetter. That's greenlight.com/designbetter to try Greenlight for free. greenlight.com/designbetter.
Support for Design Better comes from our friends at CrashPlan. Visit crashplan.com/designbetter for 50% off your first year of CrashPlan. From my daughter's first birthday to my son's first soccer game, if you're like me, you have thousands of precious family photos that only exist in digital form. That's why I've been using CrashPlan for a decade and a half now to back up all my important files. CrashPlan works efficiently in the background while you work, encrypting and sending all your new or changed files up to their secure cloud server every 15 minutes. And they make it simple to restore some or all of your data. And with unlimited version retention, CrashPlan can also be your ultimate rewind button. Businesses of all sizes benefit from CrashPlan's multi-tenant capabilities. Buy as many user licenses as you need and easily manage them all under one account. Go to crashplan.com/designbetter for 50% off your first year of CrashPlan. That's crashplan.com/designbetter, all one word, for 50% off your first year. Back up better with CrashPlan.
Web designers, this one's for you. I've got 1 minute to tell you about Wix Studio, the web platform for agencies and enterprises. So here are a few things that you can do from start to finish in 1 minute or less on Studio. You can adapt your designs for every device using responsive AI, reuse assets like templates, widgets, sections, and design libraries across sites and share them with your team. Switch up the styling of hundreds of web pages. That means fonts, layouts, colors, all in a click. Add no-code animations and gradient backgrounds right in the editor. Export your designs from Figma to Wix Studio in just a click. Oh, and one more big one. Package and deliver everything your client needs in one smooth handover. Time's up, but the list keeps going. Step into Wix Studio and see for yourself. And now, back to the show.
There's one thing that I've noticed in interviewing users over decades. When it's done well, there's like reading between the lines. Sometimes it's reading in between the lines of what people are saying, and sometimes it is catching the right cues. So like someone leans in, their posture changes. One of my favorite cues is someone drops an F-bomb, and you can tell like, okay, well, this is very important to them. And sometimes they won't tell you exactly what they think. You sort of have to find your way there. I wonder if you have any insights or guidance on these topics.
It's a great observation. I think the body language, the other kinds of communication, and which is much harder over remote, I think. But if you're in the room with somebody, you can just sort of feel things change. I often use like the term spidey sense. It's just kind of a catch-all for that. And I think the more you interview, the more you start to sense, almost without even really thinking about them, what that energy is or where there's something that's being told. There's one aspect here, which is that as interviewers, we ask follow-up questions, right? It's not question, answer. It's just question, answer, follow-up, answer, follow-up, answer, follow-up. And so you're trying to get to the point where you understand something, and that's different than getting an answer to your question. So you ask a question, you get an answer, and you have to have that spidey sense that, so body language is feeding into that, F-bombs is feeding into that. You kind of describe somebody maybe isn't telling you. And I think you want to sort of feel that. And so you can kind of look at yourself like, do I get it? Or am I still kind of confused? And so if you're confused, ask another follow-up question. And there are many different ways to ask a follow-up question. And you can, I think I talk in the book about like asking people to compare. So the behavior you're describing now, is that how you did things when you were a kid? Is that how you would expect your kids to do it? Is that the way that your neighbors kind of get involved? You keep sort of throwing the same question. You don't really care how the neighbors work about this activity. And they can't obviously predict accurately how their children are going to do it. But it gives them more chance to unpack that thing that they're not telling you. Is not because they're choosing not to tell you. Like they may not be clear about it, or they may not know that they haven't told you. So you're trying to give them space to talk about it in a different way. So when you ask them to compare across time or across people, it's a facilitative technique, right? Well, I would expect my kids to not have the constraint that I have right now. And so they would do something different. So the takeaway there is there's a constraint that they perceive they have, which they didn't tell us about, which is driving their behavior. Like that's the thing you get to where then you think like, oh, I understand. So I think the emotional cues, the language, the physical language, people laugh or they kind of mutter things or they do all sorts of stuff that kind of says there's something else going on. You can also ask them about that. I noticed when I asked you that last question, I kind of got a laugh, like, tell me what that's about. That isn't confrontational. I think you can ask it in sort of a gentle way, again, that says, I'm listening to you and I'm interested and I want to know more. So those questions about what they're not telling you are rapport builders. There's a quick example here. I've told the story before. I think it's in the book about working with some interviewers, and one guy was extremely charming, great. You met him and you're like, I want to have a beer with you. Like, if that was a thing that you would say, right? It was the interviewer, and he interviewed, and I was kind of coaching him, kind of a nervous guy. And this nervous guy, and he's charming him. I think he's really, really good at that. And he's putting him at ease. And he asks him a question about his process, and the guy describes his process and then says, and then I go and have a panic attack. And it was less about the body language or the F-bomb thing. He laid that out there. And the person that was with all the charm, the interviewer, didn't ask him about it. He just moved on. And afterwards, I asked him why not. And he said that he felt uncomfortable because that guy revealed something. And I think we often mistake our own discomfort. So back to the, why did you laugh? That might not feel like a comfortable question because we would rationalize it. I'm going to make the other person uncomfortable because I'm going to confront them. But actually, it's that we're uncomfortable, right? We're uncomfortable with somebody exposing their vulnerability or something like that. Like, he didn't know what to do with that. He didn't know how to say to that guy in a safe, trusting way, like, oh, why do you have a panic attack when that happens? And if you're listening to that today and not reading a transcript, you'll hear me say it in a way that I think is not confrontational. But that interviewer felt like that would be confrontational because he didn't sort of have the confidence to ask the question that way. But what was happening was that participant, the guy who was more nervous in the situation, it's like a trust fall, right? I'm going to expose my vulnerability to see how safe am I with you. So if you tell somebody, I'm going to have a panic attack, and they go, and move to the next question, that's like a big trust moment lost. So it's not only, I think, as you're kind of saying, Aaron, like there's an opportunity to get deeper when you get those cues. There's almost a responsibility to do that. Like a responsibility not just to your subject matter, but to your participant. When they give you those cues, they're teetering a little bit like, should I share with you? And some people may totally disagree with it. That's fine. I think there is sort of a whole ethical component about not coercing people to be vulnerable. And I think there's a nuance there between supporting them when they're asking for permission to be vulnerable versus kind of exploiting them. And I think the details really kind of matter in that.
Steve, if somebody is new to research, so the class I teach, the students have gone through, a little bit of kind of UX research training, but not a lot. So if it's their first kind of real world job, they might either not remember the basics or felt like they haven't fully absorbed it. But maybe you could talk a little bit about, for those who are new to this type of work, what are some of the differences between UX research and if I'm just interviewing somebody to get a story out of them?
Yeah, there's a podcast I'll recommend. It's called The Turnaround with Jesse Thorne. And it was maybe like 8 years ago that he did a bunch of episodes where he interviewed interviewers about interviewing. And they're all journalists, or I don't know, Larry King was on there. Mark Maron is on there. So they're maybe sort of media interviewers, but, folks from NPR and so on. It was really, really fascinating. I enjoyed listening to it to find, to your question, like the commonalities and the differences. Yeah, they had Ira Glass from This American Life on, and he talked about how he's just always thinking about the tape. Like, you do these interviews to get tape. That's the product that they're trying to produce. And so asking people to say things again, I think knowing what the quote is, and I can't remember all of his tactics, but just that I was really struck by the difference, that they were really focused on the end point. And so like I was saying a minute ago that, and maybe I get to be super self-indulgent, but I'm interviewing to get to my understanding because that's what I have to kind of produce and share back. Even the context that we're in right now, you're interviewing me for a podcast. And I've also done interviews for a podcast that I have. And I had to unlearn some things. When I'm doing my podcast, I think about the audience. It's kind of like the Ira Glass tape thing. Like, if someone says something and I know what they mean, but it was too jargon laden, I'm thinking about somebody listening that doesn't know what a three-sided marketplace is, for example. And so I'll ask them to explain. And so I'm an audience advocate in that case. There may also be things that I let go. Like we were talking before about sort of following up in a UX interview. I kind of go to the point at which, what's the point at which that person's going to be pissed off at me, and just let's back off from that slightly. But when I'm doing let's call it a media interview or trying to create some content or something, being journalistic, there's a point at which it's not interesting to listen to me ask 8 follow-up questions. So I sometimes let go of my need to understand, kind of if I'm thinking about being an audience advocate. And in an interview like a podcast, we didn't do this, but sometimes you'll do like a pre-interview and kind of talk about the topics. It's an artifact. I guess a UX research interview is an artifact as well. But I think it's the difference in my intent. One is to get to what is, my own understanding so that I have the, information available to bring to somebody. But no one's going to watch that interview again and think like, oh, this is really boring. I don't know why he's asking 8 times about why the neighbors do it this way and why their children are going to do it this way. That's a tool to get to understanding. But we, and I'm including you all as podcast hosts in this, we wouldn't probably do that in an interview, or maybe we would edit it out. I think we have sort of different tools kind of going on there. But I think the underlying intent and what we sort of indulge or sacrifice to support that intent are different.
Steve, there's some interviewing techniques that I found fascinating that are questions that aren't things that you want answers to, but they are devices to help a person go into their memory and access their memory in ways that they might not have otherwise been able to do. Example is there's a methodology called the switch interview methodology. It's for people who have recently bought a product or recently switched away from a product. So you could do these interviews semi-regularly with your customers to see like, what is it that brings people in and what is it that brings people away? And one of the techniques is to start an interview with a little monologue. Pretend I'm a documentary filmmaker and I'm going to ask you some weird questions. It's just so you can take me there so I can understand the language and the thinking behind this decision. Do you remember where you were when you purchased this product? And in reality, you don't care. Do you remember what day? Do you remember where you were sitting? Were you drinking a cup of coffee? So there's a series of questions that is sort of like stage setting that takes someone into that memory to access it in ways that they wouldn't have. Have you seen that used to good effect in interviewing users?
So to be honest, I haven't heard of that tactic as you're describing it. I guess the thing that it makes me think about is that there is a progression in the dynamic of the interview anyway. And that sounds like that technique is trying to be very intentional about it. You can ask somebody a question at the beginning of an interview, at the end of the interview, and you're going to get a different answer because they're in a different state. We've talked about rapport building over and over and over again in the way that tells people that you care about what they're saying and that you're interested in it. And I think that accrues over time and changes the dynamic if you keep demonstrating that. So I guess I agree with the principle for sure that you start off with certain kinds of questions at the beginning, regardless, right? Setting the stage. Who are they? Who lives here? How long have you had this job? What are your responsibilities? What do you do day to day? Whatever that is kind of opens things up. And then you get to the how, the why, what you expect for the future. And if you've kind of done that, I sort of follow the general purpose version of that. And that's like a really specific implementation of that. The general principle here is go from easy, objective questions with short answers to warm up the interview, to build rapport. And then later on, you get to the in-depth, subjective, aspirational, underlying motivation. You build kind of in richness and complexity as you kind of go over time. And you need time in that conversation to do it. And so someone has designed a method that says like, all right, we're going to ask very specific questions about a very specific use case, but we're going to apply that same principle there. I don't know if this is true, but let's just hypothetically say like those first 8 questions or whatever could be another 8 questions if you don't really care about it. I don't know. And maybe someone has really got some theory that says, here's how those specific 8 questions do build to that stage. But I don't know enough about what the source of that is, but I think that general principle of warming people up. And maybe those questions help with priming, which is for sure a thing that we do, right? We give people homework exercises so that they can have people log every instance of time they did a web search, and then get together and talk about it. Your point is good. We don't necessarily care about the instance, but we care about the act of reflecting on those instances helps that person be more reflective than they would otherwise be. So I think you can guide it, and I think it's also just time. It's why, like, intercepts interviews, where you stop somebody on the street or you pop up something on a website and ask people like a couple of questions. It's hard to get any depth out of those because you can't get to that stage that those switch interviews are getting or that we're trying to get to in any kind of interview.
On the topic of depth, how do you think about getting people to talk about the important things you want to learn about and not just try to be pleasing you and saying things that they think you want to hear?
Right. I think I would recommend everyone to be on the other side of an interview, to experience what it's like to be interviewed and to pay attention to that pleasing thing, because there's just a power dynamic that goes on in these situations that's unavoidable. And I think we in the interviewing role don't realize how much power we do have and how much people want to please us and how that can, to your point, kind of go awry. The example I give about that often is just this idea of asking a question with suggestions of possible answers in the question. And this goes back to the well-intentioned but naive approach that in a conversation we might give some for instances. What kind of pet do you have? Is it a dog or a turtle or a iguana? That person doing that thinks they're being friendly, right? But they're asking, what kind of pet do you have? And in fact, the person is capable of answering that question on their own. Just like the other example where it's our own discomfort that sort of manifests in a way that we change our behavior to our participant that hurts them or that limits their ability to reflect. So when you ask somebody, what kind of pet do you have? Was it a dog or a iguana or a cat? And they have a turtle. When you ask that question, they're going to say, no, it's none of those. I have a turtle. But like the 20th time you do that, especially when the question is not so fact-based, but is subjective, like, what do you prefer? What would you want to see in our product? Every time you do that, it reinforces their understanding of what it looks like to do a good job for me as the participant. So you're kind of training them. The HBO show with John Oliver, they sometimes do a segment where they show people from 60 Minutes. It's like people from 60 Minutes putting answers in the mouths of their interviewees or something like that. And you see these little moments where the reporter says, so it was a long haul. And then they cut to the person being interviewed and they go, it was a long haul. And you realize, yeah, we just have all this power to kind of control what people are saying. It's what Ira Glass talks about, but I think he's using that power for good to try to get them to say their thing. So we have some version of that power. So if you start over specifying the question, you start teaching them how to answer your question. So you don't get the depth, you don't get the sort of authentic response, you get the confirmation of your current mental model or framing. And I think the irony is that's not what you're trying to do when you do that. You're trying to be helpful. You're trying to give them some scaffolding to answer your question. But I think it has the opposite effect. And so this to me is like the number one thing to stop doing, because we all do it. And I think in interviews, it's a pretty natural thing to do. It gets around the pleasing thing, but it's hard. It's really, really, really hard. And I guess, for anyone listening, the next time you try it, because you're going to try it and you're going to pay attention to it and you're going to realize how hard that is and why it's kind of worth mentioning, because it is so kind of instinctive for us. I think in that we want to connect with people. We want to support them. We want to build rapport. We want to care about them. That's why we're doing this. That's who we are in this. And to not give that person something feels kind of cold or unkind. And yet it is actually much more generous to them.
Let's go deeper into this, because there are a lot of things that we screw up in interviews where we ask the question the wrong way, we introduce biases and so forth. Are there two things that you could point to that we could do better with our user interviews to get better data, better learnings?
One of them, I think, is follow-up questions, is to not go and ask your discussion guide like it's a verbal survey. that the guide is a guide. And this, you talked about art and science squishing together, how to use a guide, right? We could talk about how to write a guide. Like the guide is a set of questions that sort of stands in for what you think that discussion is going to look like. I think there's a lot of craft in how do you actually run the interview with that artifact. You're better off writing a guide than going in and winging it, but it takes some experience to learn how much do you improvise with that guide. When you ask question 1 and someone gives an answer that's about question 13, do you shift to question 13? That's a different part of the flow. Or do you stick to 1 and you kind of follow your flow? Or do you say, that's great, I'm going to want to come back to that later. I have a little bit more to ask about this initial topic. There's not one way to go. I'm giving sort of very generic kind of scenarios. Yeah, maybe those are my two. Okay, here's my two. One is asking follow-up questions. And really, I would love to have an interview where I ask the first question on the guide and then everything else that I ask is a response to what that person has said. And you can actually do that and cover all the topics that you have, but you do it in sort of a more organic way and not in kind of a linear way. And I guess the corollary to that is just in general, how comfortable do you feel in using that guide? I don't think there's a right way or a wrong way. You can stick to the guide and still ask follow-up questions, or you can jump all over the place depending where the person takes you. Sometimes that can feel a little chaotic. It just depends on your energy and their energy. And then the next interview, you might kind of switch it up again as you learn things. Certain parts of the guide are less interesting or less generative. You don't need to kind of cover that with everybody. You might try starting at the end and kind of working backwards, even though we just said the technique is to prime and kind of work up to it. So I think there is a change things up confidence that comes with time. That's not a beginner tactic. So yes, follow-up questions and have some comfort in how you want to use that guide. Like when I run workshops with people, people we have them do this exercise, write a guide and then go do a practice interview, and just their struggle, I didn't have enough questions, or, we got through my guide in 2 seconds, or I didn't know what to do when the person answered a question that was from somewhere else. I think that comfort with the guide, it's really the guide is sort of the stand-in for the interview. And when you get there and actually do it, what that actually feels like and how you want to be asking questions with what you've prepared, it's just something you want to have a little bit of a point of view about. And again, there's no one way to do it, no right way to do it, but having some intention behind that, and then, evolving as you kind of do more kind of over your career.
So speaking of follow-ups, I had a quick follow-up to our prior question about getting folks in the right mindset not to be too agreeable. I don't know that you could recruit for different personality types, but you can measure personality on the dimension of agreeable versus disagreeable. Aaron is obviously very far on the disagreeable side of things, where I'm more on the agreeable side.
It's true. I totally don't agree with that.
Would there be any benefit to having a mix of those kind of personality types, or in essence, does it not matter?
Yeah, I think that when you think about recruiting participants, there are many, many interesting aspects. Let's just say we could easily, obtain these details about somebody. Either we have it or we could kind of screen that in. I think we're sort of spoiled for choice with stuff that we could find interesting that could kind of change the nature of kind of how we learn things. And I think it's easy to overcomplicate recruiting, especially for a qualitative study where you're going to talk to, for me, 16 people would be a really big study. So that's an interesting criteria. And I'm kind of get in line, because most importantly is do you own this product? Are you a last 6 months user or an 8 years user? Are you someone in a household with children? Are you a household without children? There's a lot of criteria that are really going to change how they are doing the thing we're interested in, whatever that thing is. The last recruit I was involved in, we were talking to managers inside a company. And it was how big is their team and how distributed is their team? And were they a manager before they came to this company, or did they get kind of promoted up? And we were looking at kind of skills of management. That does not scratch the surface about all the interesting things about management. I think we wanted to get a spread of disciplines, because for sure an engineering manager and a marketing manager and a legal manager are just, they're in different disciplines. So they're going to probably think about this a little differently. I think that's where you say we'd like a mix of, We wanted a mix of men and women. We wanted a mix of people at different stages in their career. So I agree with you in principle. It's kind of like the switch interview. Like, we need a really specific case, which the switch interview is intended to address. A really specific case where, yeah, we want a range of personality types or whatever sort of softer characteristic of how someone behaves in order to make sure we get at something. So I love it. I think we're just limited by the logistics and try not to get complex. Disagree with me, Aaron.
No, I that all makes sense to me. I don't disagree.
Damn it.
I don't disagree, unfortunately. Steve, what are you reading, watching, learning about that has you excited right now?
I have to admit, for someone that has written nonfiction, I'm like a bad reader of nonfiction, especially like industry stuff. There's so much content and so little time to consume it. I don't drive very much, but when I do, I like some podcasts. There's a podcast I'll recommend. It's like very adjacent to, I think, anything we're talking about. It's called a Decoder Ring. It looks at stories that have been in the culture for a period of time and revisits them. I heard an amazing one the other day. It's, I think, a fairly recent one about an educational video game that was developed in the 80s, I think. It might have been the early 90s, that kind of builds on those slavery simulation experiences. The person that invented this as like a experience for kids, I think often, where they go in this immersive experience and they are simulating, what it was like to be enslaved and to try to escape. They translated this into, that person advised on the creation of a game, but it was a simulation that was sent to schools. And it's an amazing sort of innovation failure story, because I think all the intentions were there. Really, they thought about the dialect that was used. Everything was kind of rooted in thoughts about aspects of the Black experience then and up till now, and a lot of attention to historical authenticity. And it gets put into classrooms unsupervised, where it gets used by, these are kids. This is adult material they're encountering unguided. And so white kids end up bullying Black kids, sort of using this. And they ended up pulling the game out of the schools, I think, immediately. There was no lack of, good intentions. And, it's a very contemporary topic in the United States. How do we talk about the reality of Black history? And we have places where we're very uncomfortable. We won't let people do that, just to see kind of the roots of that. But think of it as like a business case where they foresaw some use cases, but they designed for the ideal. A teacher's going to read the 60-page book and create a guided experience, and there'll be chances to talk about it. And if there's a mixed group of people with different backgrounds, here's how it's going to be facilitated. But the reality of how something gets deployed, which I think is familiar to any of us, invites all kinds of misuse. And in this case, there were kids that were bullied. I mean, I think the consequences were poor, even though the intentions and the authenticity was great. It's sort of a history podcast that talks about all kinds of stuff, just from sort of media and society. And anyway, I just really thought that episode was very distressing, but also very relatable, I think.
Fantastic. And where can people learn more about you and your book, second edition, Interviewing Users?
Yeah, if you want to find me, you can find my website, which is my last name, Portigal, portigal.com. And I spend a lot of time on LinkedIn talking about stuff related to, like we're talking about today. If people are interested in buying the book, and there is a discount code available, if you buy the book from the publisher, which is great to support small businesses and support authors when you buy from publishers, as opposed to, at least in this case, opposed to larger vendors. So Rosenfeld Media at rosenfeldmedia.com is the publisher. The code is Design Better, and that will get you 20% off Interviewing Users second edition.
Steve, thank you so much for being on Design Better.
Thank you so much for all the great questions and good discussion.
This episode was produced by Eli Woolery and me, Aaron Walter, with engineering and production support from Brian Paik of Pacific Audio. If you found this episode useful, we hope that you'll leave us a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to finer shows. Or simply drop a link to the show in your team's Slack channel, designbetterpodcast.com. It'll really help others discover the show. Until next time.